always been into making comic books, and when I started making music, I figured there must be some way to combine making comic books with making music. So I started making these things that I call low-budget films, and some of them are sort of documentaries. So this one is a low-budget documentary film thing on the topic of the French Revolution. I like to dedicate this to the Occupy Wall Street movement because I sort of think of the French Revolution as like kind of an early example of a sort of Occupy movement. And it goes like this. The king of France was absolute, the people all were destitute. The year was 1789. Churches paid no income tax, neither did aristocrats. Wars were costing money all the time. But Enlightenment ideas had entered people's ears, like liberty, equality, and brotherhood. People starving broke under feudalism's yoke, knew no church or king was gonna do them any good. There was such financial crisis, the king had to take advice to try an old thing called Estates General government. The Estates General had 3 votes, nobles, church, and common folks. 2-1, the commons lose, it always went. The commons in frustration said, we represent the nation. The nobles and the church must lose their privileges. And the rich were scared for real when they stormed to the Bastille. And rebellions also broke out in the villages. At the palace in Versailles, the king and queen were heard to sigh, I guess we have to let them make a constitution now. Then the women's march embarrassed them and chased them into Paris. And the royals learned they'd lost their power anyhow. Arguments got hot, whether to keep a king or not. Different groups saw different ways to run the country best. But when the royal family tried to flee the country in disguise, they were busted and then put under a house arrest. And all of Europe's kings were terrified to hear these things, so France was threatened on all sides by enemies. And when these other kings declared, the king of France must be spared, that made the king of France look worse to revolutionaries. They built a new machine, the quick and painless guillotine. They said it's fairer than the king's medieval torture rack. They put it to a vote and then they dropped it on his throat, and every king around the world just had a heart attack. So they attacked from north and south, and they attacked from east and west, till revolutionary France was in a desperate state. And when the radical Marat was killed politically, now that was what it took for France's outlook to degenerate. The new leader, Robespierre, said enemies are everywhere. So for a year, the guillotine was working endlessly. And though he freed the slaves, it's true, Robespierre's head came off too. Then France was run by the more moderate Directory. But the Directory was lame, and France's only good news came from their armies out in Europe, winning more and more. And the man who made them win was General Napoleon, but when he came back home, he made himself the emperor. So it was a painful climb to get from kings to modern times, but the French Revolution always showed the way, because the ideas that sparked it first have never ever been reversed. It was the biggest change that shaped our Western world today.